It's time now for the news review program. Do stay with us. Welcome to the news review on Press TV. The number of COVID-19 infections in Europe is nearing 1.5 million. There are over 142,000 fatalities. Britain has overtaken Italy to report the highest official death toll from the coronavirus on the continent, with more than 32,000 fatalities. The UK was one of the last countries that imposed a lockdown to curb the spread of the virus. Meanwhile, Russia has reported more than 10,000 new infections for the third day in a row. The country's total cases have topped 155,000. Also on Tuesday, Spain reported a fatality tally below 200 for the third consecutive day. The country is gradually emerging from a strict lockdown, with the small businesses opening with restrictions this week. Germany confirmed over 680 new infections and some 140 new deaths, registering another daily rise in fatalities. Okay, let's get some insight and discuss it a little bit. Joining me will be Robert Carter, our correspondent in London, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, who are joining us out of Bristol. Good to see you, gentlemen. To London first, Robert. President Trump always said America first, and America is number one now in the world in terms of COVID-19 infections and fatalities. Should I offer you congratulations or condolences? Your country is also number one in Europe.
Yes, obviously we've been aware of the situation for quite some time now, and I think everyone on the ground here has come to the realization that, the government's reaction and response to the outbreak has been absolutely abysmal, to say the least. The care home crisis that we've got has been referred to as the care home killing fields. You obviously have the NHS crisis as well, which, I actually know and have family members who work for the NHS. And they're saying that their colleagues on the front lines of the A&E department, for example, are saying, don't bother coming if you have any kind of, if you can avoid it, even if you don't have coronavirus, but you have some other kind of illness or injury, try to avoid coming to A&E as best you can, because it's literally like a war zone. People running around, bodies laying around on the floor because they don't have enough seats to handle the outbreak and things like that. So, behind what you see in the media headlines, which is obviously trying to push a kind of establishment-friendly agenda, let's get behind the government are doing all they can, a little bit of criticism when it's due, but ultimately, they're talking about when will businesses open again and things like that. And the government as well setting themselves targets which they're not actually hitting, like getting the amount of tests. I think it was 100,000 tests a day by the end of April, which again, the health secretary didn't have to set that target, but then the media fell in and it kind of turned into a big game. So ultimately you have a situation where the establishment and the government is definitely being criticized for its poor response, but also the way the mainstream media here are handling it. The doom and gloom is upsetting many, and then also you have people criticizing them for, not being hard enough on the establishment either. So I think what I can say just from being here is that, people are still very concerned. They're still left in a state of ignorance largely. And there is a lot of resentment growing, both the government and also the establishment media as well.
Okay, let's go to Bristol now. Tony, wasn't there anything that the Johnson administration could have done to prevent this from happening with, such a large number of infections and also fatalities in the UK?
Well, look, I agree with your correspondent in that the government is not responding well to this. They are hitching their cart to this whole idea of there will be a vaccine coming like a knight in shining armor over the horizon, and yet that is by no means guaranteed. And even if it does come, we know that there are hints about this virus being reinfected as well. So whether a virus can help in that situation is another enormous question the government hasn't addressed. It's decided that it's going to also have a mobile phone application, which is going to contact trace everybody, and there's all sorts of serious concerns about the long-term privacy there. And also, of course, the main people that need to be protected by that app don't have smartphones, many of them. That's the elderly. So this doesn't seem as if it's been at all well thought through by the British government. But I also think that the 32,000 deaths that Britain has now supposedly got to today is an exaggeration of the figures. You have to look really at the number of people who've died per million of population around Europe, obviously in other parts of the world too. But Britain is, in the middle of the score there in Europe. It's not at the top and it's not at the bottom. Belarus has had 2,000 per million population have died of this supposed COVID-19. But then that brings in another thing, doesn't it? Have people died of COVID-19 or with COVID-19? And our media, certainly our mass media, seem to be mixing up the terms time and time again. There's a very big difference. Those that have died of it, that means they had no underlying issues. And those who died with it had other issues as well that the COVID-19 was part of. So there's a great deal of problem with these figures, because what's happening is the doctors are including anybody that's had a part death due to COVID-19 with the official death toll. They even call it a death toll,
Right.
just I think to scare people. So Britain is very low down that list. The UK is at 420 deaths per million population. Italy's above that at 480, Spain at 550, Belgium nearly 700. So, Britain, okay, so I think we've obviously got to keep a check on this, but the figures can be very, very misleading. And those high figures could easily be because the UK and the USA, looks to me, and evidence has come out of Iceland and France just yesterday, that Britain may well have been much further into this epidemic than they realised back in March, with the disease spreading even in December and January, but not having been recognised here.
Mm-hmm. Now, Robert, a quick question. There are also different other issues because of COVID-19. We hear about hate crimes against Chinese, and we also hear about more violence within British families. Tell us a bit about that in 1 minute, please.
Yes, so domestic abuse is a major problem. It affects pretty much every society. But obviously now we're in a situation where you're forced to stay in your homes. Obviously, the concern was raised initially that this would be a problem, and it turns out that actually, yes, there is a lot of evidence to say that domestic abuse cases are spiking. Call centers are getting an increased number of complaints about this. And then also on social media, there's been several viral stories which have been picked up by the press as well, of women essentially posting pictures of themselves battered and bruised as a result of being stuck at home with an abusive partner. Also with ethnic minorities, you already mentioned the report which states that there is growing attacks and violence against people of an Asian background because of the China virus, as it's been described in certain countries, particularly peddled by Western leaders like Donald Trump and the White House and things like that. That's an increase. But also there has been issues raised about the fact that it seems as if some media platforms are trying to connect ethnic minorities and also British Muslims with the virus for some reason. We've seen major complaints from the Muslim Council of Britain, which is the largest Muslim representative body here in the UK. They've been raising issues about how the BBC, for example, every time they discuss the story, the image they use under the headline of coronavirus tends to be a woman wearing a hijab, for example. Right. And it happens time and time again. So why they're making that connection at this time is obviously very concerning when you know that Islamophobia is a major issue here in the West.
Right. Now, Tony, we're running out of time, but one last question. And are you hopeful that Prime Minister Johnson could do something about it, or should Britain simply stay at home and to try to sort of, let's say, pray this killer virus away?
Well, that's really, I mean, I'm not stopping people who want to pray, but what we need is a government that's actually thought things through. Like the Swedish government, for example, you don't have to either have a lockdown or no lockdown. What they've decided is to segregate their society into those who are most vulnerable of dying. Let's remember that even in Belarus, which has had these massive amount of people dying, it's only 0.2% of the population. It's comparable in Britain, with the epidemic. We had a flu 2 winters ago. 50,000 extra people died there. But what they should be doing really is to be looking at those people who are most likely to be vulnerable to COVID-19 and making sure that they are protected, letting the rest of society, as has happened in Sweden, catch the disease, get treated for the disease, and those people can then protect the rest of society by stopping it spreading in future. We've built up for ourselves here in Britain an enormous problem. That is the second and the third wave.
Right.
And as it stands, as the lockdown finishes, those waves are going to continue. But in Sweden, they protected themselves. And in other countries, they protected themselves against that happening.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. We had Robert Carter, our correspondent in London, and also Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, who joined us out of Bristol. That's the end of this news review.